Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Catherine Meller, and I'm the Cultural Program Coordinator at the Goethe-Institut, New York. Whether you're joining us from breakfast on the West Coast or in Colorado, like Ben, lunchtime on the East Coast, or dinner time in Europe, we invite you to grab a cup of coffee, perhaps a glass of wine, as we spend the next hour imagining utopia in this conversation with Benjamin Kunkel and Ilija Trojanow. This talk is part of a larger event series called Democracy Will Win, What Spaces Are We Fighting For?, which grew out of the exhibition Thomas Mann, Democracy Will Win, presented in partnership with Villa Aurora Thomas Mann House and the Trojanow House München. And it's on view in our public space at 30 Irving Place in New York through November 4th. Our programming in this series focuses on the physical spaces of democracy, or what spaces democracies need to function. Other events in this series have focused on specific architectures or existing physical spaces. But today we get to take a leap into the imaginative. The question, what are we fighting for, is crucial because if we don't have a vision for a better world, how can we actually build that better world? Tackling the questions of utopia and democracy today are Ilija Trojanow and Benjamin Kunkel. Ilija Trojanow was born in Bulgaria in 1965. After fleeing his homeland, he was granted political asylum in Germany. He spent 10 years in Kenya and 5 years in Mumbai before returning to Germany, where he remains one of the country's preeminent literary novelists. Most recently, his book, The Lamentations of Zeno, was translated by Philip Boehm and published by Verso Books in 2016. Benjamin Kunkel is the author of the best-selling book Indecision and a founding editor of N+1, as well as the author of Utopia or Bust, A Guide to the Present Crisis. He has written for The New Yorker, Dissent, and the London Review of Books, and he lives in Colorado. A couple of quick notes for housekeeping before I disappear from your screen. Ilija and Ben will present in turn, and then they'll be in conversation with each other. And we'll finish up with the Q&A portion where you'll be able to contribute with your own ideas or questions. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the event, so be nice, first of all. But if you have a question while the event is running that you think we might not remember by the time we get to the Q&A, please feel free to just type it into the chat. I'll make a note of it, and then we can get to your question when it's time at the end. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Ilija.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good midday, good afternoon, good evening, good night. I'm really happy to be here. According to me, the more utopia, the better. And I really look forward to our conversation. So what is a democratic space? Maybe the neighborhood park, the bus lane, the bicycle lane, the communal assembly, or the regional parliament, Hyde Park Corner or Zuccotti Park, parts of the internet, maybe, pockets of resistance, the hideaways of partisans or guerrilleros, of refuseniks and pirates. What I would like to suggest is that utopia is the essential democratic space. Might sound like a contradiction because, of course, utopos in Greek means no place, nowhere. But this is only a contradiction if we misunderstand what utopian thinking and democratic practice means and or should mean. Firstly, we shouldn't confuse what does not exist with what is impossible, which is how most people nowadays use the word utopian in everyday parlance. Let's say, tell the sun to leave the sky, to quote an old evergreen. That's impossible, unless you can one day privatize the sun. That would be dystopian. To abolish slavery, to allow women to vote, to exterminate hunger, that seemed or seems impossible, but only for a while. Progress, what we understand as progress, is nothing but utopia come true. By envisaging new and differing realities, we are imagining alternatives into existence. This is what Robert Musil, the great Austrian novelist, famously meant by Möglichkeitssinn. That's in German, difficult to translate, but not impossible. Möglichkeitssinn, which basically means that utopia is not a blueprint, not the construction plan of a crazy architect, but the sharing of a larger horizon, the liberation of the future from the shackles of the established social, political, and economic order. A liberation from the status quo, especially, of course, for those members of the demos who are marginalized, who feel left out. And for those of us who insist on dreaming of a better world. Not that few, I may add, and my impression is that we are growing in number. There was a friend of mine who a few years back put together an anthology. In German, the title was In welcher Gesellschaft wollen wir leben? In which society would we like to live? And the interesting thing is he invited leading sociologists, political scientists, artists, and other people who he deemed competent. And not one of them, even those who had conservative leanings, suggested that the existing order was close to the one they would like to live in, with a few improvements here or there. Everyone, absolutely everyone, had a radically different model in mind when asked to dream freely. So at the end of the day, everybody was radical in his or her visions. Secondly, the second misunderstanding is that democracy is a system of institutions and hierarchies, which is unfortunately taught in school and even in some universities. Democracy is a process, a work in progress, far from completed. And all this talk about the will of the founding fathers or the deep meaning of the Constitution, in German, the Grundgesetz, is nothing more but political single entry bookkeeping, the achievements of the past neatly accounted for, or future-bound aspirations written out of the discourse. Grundgesetz means foundational law. So we can detect a certain obsession with the foundations of democracy, both in the US and in Germany, which might be typical of building contractors, but which also implies ex negativo that any other structure is a Luftschloss, a castle in the air, a mirage, a daydream, which, by the way, is exactly how Ernst Bloch, one of the leading utopian philosophers, describes the utopian craving as, and I cite, Träume von einem besseren Leben, voller utopischer Hoffnung und Möglichkeiten. Easily translated, dreams of a better life, full of utopian hope and possibility. No wonder that this is regarded, even in the so-called democratic states and countries, as subversive by all the gatekeepers and the security guards of the status quo, vilified most often as dubious or even dangerous. Our political architecture is based on the idea of stability, and that implies a static understanding of democracy. Thus, every inconsistency and every injustice that is written into the foundation is, through time, solidified, even fossilized, while the empowering and liberating energy of the political imagination is shunned and negated. Every space is defined, just like the human body, by pre-existing conditions, inherent dogmas, dogmas that need to be continuously challenged, for they define our understanding, our individual and common understanding of justice and wealth, of happiness and progress. A truly democratic process has to be based on the assumption that convictions and priorities, instruments and institutions are fallible, has to be allowed to imagine a turning of the tables, an upside down, a reversal, a jump into the unknown. And incidentally, the German constitution starts off with an astonishing proclamation. In German, die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar. Roughly translated, the dignity of the human being is unassailable. Now, this is either nonsense or pure utopian thinking. We know that even in the wealthy societies of the global north, the dignity of some of us continues to be assailed, mistreated. Just one example out of a multitude. During the pandemic, the German public became aware of the working conditions in the large slaughterhouses of the north, where men, mostly, from the country of my birth, Bulgaria, mostly, have been toiling long and dangerous hours for a pittance, penned up in dilapidated quarters similar to the animals they butcher. No dignity there, far and wide, and no argument. Thus, the glorious beginning of the German constitution only makes sense as an ideoscape, as an aspirational space, and not as an existing reality, not in our neighborhoods, not at court, and certainly not in parliament. And therefore, even the existing constitution clearly defines utopian thinking as the true foundation of the foundational law. However, and that's one of the problems we have been forced to battle, especially in the last few decades, utopian thinking has been made responsible for the horrors of the 20th century, along the lines of the very influential Karl Popper, whose argument was that every utopia is a totalitarian concept that seeks to exterminate any other competing vision. It's understandable that a survivor like Karl Popper of the Second World War, in an exhausted and traumatized mental state, would yearn for pragmatic solutions, for small words and smaller wins. But from a historical distance, I believe it's clear nowadays that the totalitarian systems and the state terror of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, or China was more of a continuation of old principles and mechanisms, among them authoritarian hierarchy, fanatical nationalism, oppressive patriarchy, racism, nepotism, imperialism, and of course, capitalism. For even when the state runs the profit-making, exploitative machine, it is still capitalism. The only utopian aspect in these systems of subjugation and repression was in the realm of the rhetorical. We cannot allow this to continue. The absence of utopia is a debilitating social restriction. And by the way, when I was recently leafing through a bibliography of utopian writing, a 500-page book, it became apparent that eras of progress and phases of cultural and democratic flowering were always accompanied by a wealth of utopian writing. Reactionary times, on the other hand, by a dearth of utopian visions. This absence is more than just a cause for painful cultural regret. It expresses, now more than ever, an existential threat. Whenever there's a paradigm shift, society needs the wisdom of radical imagination. It's no exaggeration to claim that we are facing the greatest challenge that a complex civilization has ever faced before, and that we need to envisage other forms of production, interaction, and cooperation than the predominant. But unfortunately, globalism means that this juggernaut we call capitalism truly rules the universe, which, by the way, is exactly the Sanskrit meaning of the word juggernaut, without exception, which in itself is a terrifying thought. Monoculture is bad enough in agriculture. In the political realm, it spells doom. Alternative realities, like the commons, have more or less disappeared. Meanwhile, even the air we breathe is partly privatized through the marketplaces for CO2. In order to survive, we will have to redefine our modes of planetary existence, and this will be impossible without utopian imagination. Thus, utopia is not the art of the impossible, as many believe. It is the rationale of the necessary. Or, as my colleague Benjamin Kunkel wrote in the title to his intriguing collection of essays, Utopia or Bust. Thank you very much. And now over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Ilya. And thank you, Catherine, for introducing us both. By the way, that's the tail of my cat, Olive, who may be making an appearance during my remarks and the rest of our conversation. And thank you, Ilya, particularly for ending very graciously with an allusion to my, the title of my collection of essays, which was, as you say, Utopia or Bust. I suppose what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes is not an alternative, Utopia or Bust, Utopia or Collapse, but something like their combination, Utopia and Bust, Utopia and Collapse. But before doing that, and let me just time myself to make sure I don't go over. Hold on just a second. I want to do a kind of brief historicization of the sort of fortunes of the concept in Utopia, as I see it in our time. I think that the fortunes of this concept have changed. I don't want to sort of recommend one conception of utopia or another, but to suggest that differing concepts of utopia over the last 30 or so years have reflected differing political needs. The utopian thinker that was most important to me, certainly the living one, in the 90s was Frederick Jameson, who wrote about utopia quite a bit. And I think, the function of utopia in his work was clearly indebted to Adorno on the one hand, and it sort of prefigured this sort of alter globalization slogan that we became familiar with around the year 2000 and before, namely, another world is possible. So I think during the 90s and into this century, there was a tremendous sense of kind of political and even sort of civilizational stasis. And what was crucial about the concept of utopia was to insist in the slogan of the ultra-globalization movement that another world was possible. Indeed, that the end of history of a kind of liberal capitalism wasn't the only type of society that could exist, and that indeed, another type of society could be brought into being, would be brought into being at some future date. And another aspect of Jameson's thinking, I suppose, was to insist on the kind of political or the utopian moment of all political movements, including the ones that we most deplore. That is to say, that there's a sense in which we already live in someone's utopia, but it's just not ours. It is the utopia of something much closer to someone like Hayek's utopia, the utopia of the neoliberals, rather than our own. Although a strength of neoliberalism was always that that this was not quite yet utopia. One could always argue for more privatization, for markets to be even freer than they were. And I think this utopian component of neoliberalism was a very important part of its political force. But in any case, during this time of kind of tremendous stasis and apparent sort of geopolitical stability, I think it was quite important just to insist on utopianism as a principle, kind of principle of hope, as Bloch would have it, insisting that our society would one day change and that we must continue to imagine that it could change. But that was kind of it. That was just this sort of blank principle was about all that could be asked or that was asked of utopianism at the time. I think sometime over the last 15 years or so, with the global financial crisis, with movements like Occupy, and also with the kind of recognition sometime in the middle of the first decade of this century that global warming was not, or climate change, climate chaos was not a reality to worry about in terms of future generations, but was the wolf at the door, really. I think that has changed the nature of our utopianism and moved it away from being a kind of blank principle of hope towards something more desperate and pragmatic. Jameson is credited with saying, and there are versions of this line credited to de Zizek as well, although I think in The Seeds of Time, you find Jameson saying this pretty directly, that it's easier in our time, but of course this is not now the same time, 1994, when he wrote this, it was easier to imagine, the end of the world in ecological terms, the thoroughgoing breakdown of non-human nature, than it was the end of capitalism. And now we don't really need to imagine the thoroughgoing ecological deterioration of our world. We see it before our eyes. And we realize that to a great extent, it's inevitable. The only question is sort of how bad that deterioration will be and what kind of society we build to deal with and to the extent possible to prevent it. So it seems to me that if once upon a time the opposition really was, the alternatives really were utopia or bust, try and imagine one or the other, what we really need to do in our time is to try and imagine disaster, collapse, breakdown as a passageway to utopia, not to imagine the thoroughgoing breakdown of non-human nature as an alternative to imagining the end of capitalism, but being in fact the very way that we imagine the end of capitalism. Because we're not going, once upon a time, one could imagine capitalist development just furnishing us with a very nice material abundance, which we could sort of take over and manage in socialist or communist ways. And to some extent that is true, right? In the sense that we could think, oh, look at, we've got this tremendous consolidation of finance. Why don't we just turn this to socialist purposes? Or in fact, we've got these nice platforms. Amazon sells you every book in the world. Why don't we just turn this, and Walmart and Facebook, well, maybe we just destroy that, but towards, to socialist ends. So some of this sort of recuperation of the existing techniques for utopian purposes, I think probably we can still imagine happening. But we have to imagine this now in a deteriorated and a deteriorating ecological situation. So I think the task now is not to pose, the end of the world and the end of capitalism as oppositions, but to try and imagine these things together, because it's only together that utopia is going to come about. And with this in mind, I'd like to read a short poem by A.R. Ammons, which was more or less puts the case that I'm trying to make. It's just a few stanzas, so bear with me. It's called The Eternal City. Suggesting something of the eternal nature of Bloch's principle of hope, I suppose. So Ammons writes, after the explosion or cataclysm, that big display that does its work but then fails out with destructions, one is left with the pieces. At first they don't look very valuable, but nothing sizable remnant around for gathering the senses on. One begins to take an interest, to sort out, to consider closely what will do and won't, matters having become not only small, but critical. Bulbs may have been uprooted, they should be eaten if edible, or got back into the ground. What used to be garages, even the splinters, should be collected for fires. Some unusually deep holes or cleared woods may be turned to water supplies or sudden fields. Ruinage is hardly ever a pretty sight, but it must, when splendor goes, accept into itself, piece by piece, all the old perfect human visions, all the old perfect loves. Which is to say, ruinage is the only sight we've got for perfection. It sounds like a paradox, but I think it is actually just, our historical situation. And, in that, there's a kind of, in that poem and in what I'm trying to say, there is, I hope, a sort of gritty pragmatism, which is to say, I think it's no longer adequate just to say, another world is possible, but to do, as I think, Ilija is quite explicitly trying to do, both in his own work and in work he's doing with others, to think about the sort of pragmatics of utopia, not just another world is possible, but another world is inevitable, is coming into being, and how do we make this into the world that we want? There's a climate scientist, and I'm forgetting which one it is right now, who has said, there are no non-radical futures. Obviously, the status quo, once upon a time, seeming to represent stability, maybe back in the 90s or the early part of this century, no longer does. It represent the status quo politically and economically represents a headlong careering towards disaster. So not changing things politically is to accept this immensely rapid and disastrous transformation of the world in material and ecological terms. So the option of standing pat no longer exists, I think. So the world is rapidly changing. We're going to get a world that looks quite different from the one we've grown up in. And the question is whether that's going to be our world that we make after the image of our own desires, or whether that's going to be a world that different from ours, not in a utopian sense, but in a dystopian sense. So that's my 10 minutes or so.
Oh, thanks a lot, Ben. Yeah, let me pick up on that, because a few things that went through my mind. A beautiful book by Rebecca Solnit, Paradise Made in Hell,
yeah,
which I often cite because it really, really surprises most people to learn that when there's a breakdown or a ruinage, as you say, that there are many possibilities actually of reorganizing in a kind of utopian sense your life, your communal kind of logistical setup, while most people associate breakdown with some kind of, well, which of course is the narrative of all blockbuster films. It's kind of always basically death is knocking on the door, and the only possible solution is for a man to save his family. That's kind of the narrative, isn't it?
Yes. Yes.
Well, actually, when you read a book by like that one by Solnit, it's exactly the opposite. People come together, and I thought we had that in the beginning of the pandemic. I remember reading about Argentine, so they had something called horizontalidad, so kind of horizontal organization where people just got together and said, okay, who in the neighborhood needs food? We'll cook together. So they just started their kind of communal kitchens, went around to elderly people, sick people, so on, just brought them food, stuff like that. And then, of course, it went away again. So I guess one of the, I really like what you said about that there is no way of defending the status quo. The future is going to be radical. Either it's going to be radically dystopian or something we can look forward to. So maybe if we start off with that, what do we need most? Because that's been the thing I've been struggling with the last few years. Many people I talk to after readings and discussions are like, okay, where's the blueprint?
Mm-hmm.
What is this utopia going to look like? So my first question would be, isn't that part of the danger to kind of limit the fact that people are invited to bring in their own visions, their own hopes, and it's a limitless kind of landscape of alternate possibilities? And the second thing is, do we need new aesthetical forms of narration, of inspiration, to kind of foretell what could be a positive radical alternative?
I think those are both very good questions. The second one, even harder to answer than the first, about what kind of aesthetic forms we need. I suppose, I think that there's the effort to realize a kind of, as it were, if this is not paradoxical, a kind of ad hoc, a temporary utopia shouldn't foreclose further utopian thinking. And, the kind of things that Solnit's talking about in her book, organizations of mutual aid in the face of disaster, I think probably don't represent nearly anybody's idea of what an ideal society would look like. They instead are ways of creating a better social world in the midst of disaster. So I think maybe we can kind of imagine we can imagine a kind of utopia beyond the kind of necessary utopia, as you say. There's this sort of rationale of the necessary. There is that utopia.
Just a question there, Ben. Aren't there kind of instrumental elements like mutual aid that most of us would agree on? Isn't that kind of like a backbeat, a utopian backbeat?
Yeah.
We could imagine as a strategy of survival, but we could also imagine that to be a long-term utopian vision for a very civilized and just society.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the great question, which is probably not to be answered by way of a blueprint, but answered by way of experimentation, is a kind of coordination of scales, because the scale of the solutions Solnit talks about and that are implied in Ammon's poem and so forth are quite local, but it's clear that we live in a world in which the local, even if it wanted to, couldn't rely on itself, because every locality is subject in unpredictable ways to disasters for which local mutual aid will not be sufficient. So it seems to me like a kind of coordination of scales, which is like one of the big nature of a blueprint, right? Like you've got the scale of the room and then the scale of the city, and which is in a great big world. I think coordinating the different scales of our designs and our hopes is one of the real challenges ahead of us. But I'd like to, I know that go ahead.
Couldn't we easily agree on kind of globalization bottom up? So I think most people agree that you need kind of very strong democratic systems in place on the local level, and then kind of gradually organizing them up to some kind of globalized form of interaction and mutuality.
Yeah, I think something like that is, we could probably find wide agreement on, although once you have certain democracies behaving, that leaves us open, of course, to local tyrannies of the majority in various places that would make us very unhappy, I think. And I suppose we'd have to hope that the representatives of those localities were, defeated at the level where they represented their constituency.
Yeah, it struck me that, I mean, I think one of the strongest or most popular arguments against utopian thinking has been by Robert Nozick, who says that it's impossible to have any form of utopian philosophy because one man's utopia is another man's dystopia. Yeah. And that always troubled me, because if that were true, we would really have a problem. So what I did is I read through quite a number of kind of the famous utopian works. And I tried to distill a kind of utopian core argument or core vision. And to my great surprise and relief, that it actually does exist. Mm-hmm. Apparently, there are certain aspects of dignified life, of justice, of respect, of certain basic caring and dealing with the challenges of material existence that unites nearly every utopia that we know of. So it's not as if it's anybody's utopia for people to be dying of hunger or for people to be exploited in sweatshops. So isn't that something to build upon? To me, that was kind of a new foundation for utopian thinking, that we might not be that far apart, although the visions then kind of become very elaborately different. But in their core, we seem to have kind of common ground.
Yes. I suppose the trick is coordinating these different utopias, because, of course, like our present utopias, or if they should be designated as such, but anyway, places we might consider the nicest places to live and so forth, do involve people dying of hunger, right? It's just they off the stage. So that the sort of utopia of the wealthy first world does entail dystopias off stage. So how it is to sort of grant every district within our kind of ensemble of utopias, such that none of them can be the kind of a mere pool of resources for any other community, is obviously one of the challenges we've got ahead of us.
I'm trying to wrap my head around the fact that you think one could call certain aspects of neoliberal capitalism utopian, because I think from a historical distance, what one would probably analyze is that it's been sacrificing the necessary, which is nature, in order to come up with short-term privileges for a small global elite, which doesn't seem to me to be, of course, for members of that elite, of course, it's evidently a very nice life, but it doesn't seem to me to conform with any utopia ever suggested, neither in completely other civilizations like in African or Latin American epics, certainly not in the old Indian texts, and not in our West European utopia or North American utopian tradition. That there's a certain balance of what is available, what needs to be kind of safeguarded, and what can be used and exploited, that I think unites every utopian concept. So this current disbalance, I think, is a form of destructive violence that is way beyond any form of utopian thinking.
I certainly agree that it in practice has been, and I hope that I'm an absolute opponent of neoliberal capitalism generally, but I do think that at least from my point of view, one should credit someone like Hayek in particular as an impressive, if terribly wrong-headed, utopian thinker. Even someone like Nozick in his way, who kind of imagines a utopia of utopias, a libertarian utopia. And I think that the utopian line of neoliberal capitalism, which is to say everybody's happiness is going to be maximized to the extent that the market will be liberated. This is how you get prosperity, which everybody wants, and this is how you get freedom, which everybody says they want. I think the utopian component of neoliberalism was a very important part of it, and that's not to say anything that worthy of the name. Even probably an honest neoliberal would look around and think it actually didn't go as we'd imagined it would, and there were certain externalities that we failed to consider. But I do think here was a very powerful program for the improvement of human life in a general way.
Yeah, but just to be a little bit provocative, certain aspects of Hayek, for example, what you spoke about, individual happiness, you would probably find in Kropotkin, for example. What you would certainly not find is certain forms of individual greed, meaning, greater good. So kind of this equation, each person according to his own greed, means the best possible common good. Would it be maybe helpful to bring together, to be more inclusive in our utopian thinking by pointing out that even the visions of people we otherwise do not agree with have certain aspects of kind of the golden rule of coexistence that one does not need to throw out with the bath?
Yes. Well, I mean, do they have existence? I think, I mean, one of the features of our kind of a left utopianism is that there's not really, at least in an ideal way, an outside. Whereas I think that if we want to concede the right as having its utopian elements, there's usually an outside, right? An outside of the utopia, and often a racialized other. But, you know, one could probably, I don't know if the golden rule, maybe the golden rule applied to members of one's own race would apply to, you know, people, if we want to concede that they're utopian, you know, people like, you know, Richard Spencer, who got a lot of attention a few years ago. You know, these guys think, well, actually, if you want to have happy societies, just set up racially homogenized populations wherever you can. And there'll be, you'll have to break some eggs along the way. I mean, the strongest position of the sort of claim that, like, you know, alterity is utopia would concede the utopian element to the very ugliest political programs we can imagine, right? Which claim to be working for certainly the particular good, but, you know, there's a version of contemporary racism essentially that says, well, like, let's just get everybody in their separate, you know, racially homogenized populations, and they'll be happier that way, and we won't have to deal with them. Insofar as, like, the right has been a vehicle for utopian thinking, however ugly and indeed, you know, genocidal, I think we want to think about whether, you know, whether the left has not, you know, having been embarrassed by the alleged utopias of Stalinism and so on, whether the left has been insufficiently utopian, and I mean, I think that's kind of an implicit claim of what you're doing. Is that right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, I remember, it's a personal memory. I spent my summers in the 80s, mostly in Paris, because my uncle was there, and my uncle was politically very active, also in exile. And so he had contacts with all these people from the former Eastern Europe. And those were very formative years, because many of them were looking for what then used to be called the third way. So they were, of course, living in Paris, but they certainly did not think that this was the kind of utopian they were striving for. So kind of a mixture between, you know, anarchists and democratic socialists and whatever you might call it. Anyway, the interesting thing was that I remember one Czech intellectual, and I was very young then, I was like 17, 18, 19, telling me exactly that the problem is that we have not been utopian, quite the opposite, that we have sacrificed utopian thinking on the altar of now making practical progress. Mm-hmm. And this was kind of the fall from grace, according to him. And later on, when I read what happened in the Soviet Union, especially in the first half of 1918, this is exactly what happened. All utopian aspects, the Soviets, mm-hmm. the different forms of self-organization, of kind of democratic communal spaces, all those were shut down. Secret Service was introduced. There was a new kind of a new repressive system of control, of denunciation, of de-democratization. Mm-hmm. And since then, I've actually been thinking that we are as guilty of not being utopian enough as anybody else. And that the claim of the right that everything that went wrong in, let's say, progressive politics is because it's too utopian, seems to me to be utter nonsense. It always goes wrong because there is no utopian aspect. It's just, you know, small, detailed adage to the existing, as opposed to a really liberated new.
Yeah. How do you feel that we are sort of to coordinate our kind of immediate pragmatic politics with utopianism?
Well, I'll give you one example that, I mean, because I think there are many examples, and I can just speak from what I'm observing. As you probably know, the German Democratic Revolution had an important year in 1848, and it was in Frankfurt. Paulskirche was kind of the first kind of proto-democratic parliament. And it's going to be 175 years in 2023. And of course, the city and the German state wanted to have these typical, very, very formalized, museum-like remembrances. And quite a number of people kind of from the Frankfurt Society have come together, and I'm part of the team. And we would like to set up a new kind of assemblée that is global, where people come together from all over the world, people from different parts of life. So from people, who might be intellectual to people who are working, from indigenous people to, let's say, digital natives, whatever. And we would like to discuss something that I mentioned just in passing recently, previously, which is how do we come up with a globalized form of defining needs and visions and expressing forms of interaction, of networks, of non-state lines of communication and discussion and, of course, action that would be truly independent of what now exists as a kind of more or less centralized and more or less kind of firm north-south axis. I am being vague at this very moment because this is the whole idea that people who are involved in the organizing committee should not kind of prescribe what is going to be discussed. So basically it's really an open forum. But I think we need these spaces. And this is why I was actually glad to be invited here today, because I truly believe that we need more and more and more of these spaces, because I spent a few years back, it was actually 4 years back, traveling the world, trying to find out what other forms of kind of democratic and radical organization they are. So I was in, let's say, in the factories in Pakistan, I was in Chiapas, I was in, anyway, many places. And it occurred to me that a lot of really, really great utopian work as activism, not only as a reflection, is being done as we speak. But we are certainly not aware of it, not enough. I mean, specialists are, but not the greater public. And secondly, there is certainly not enough communication, interaction, networking. I mean, we constantly talk of networking, yet how much do we know of people, let's say, who are organized in the sweatshops in Karachi? I thought I knew a little bit, and I went there and I realized I don't know anything. And the necessity for those people to express what their visions, what their hopes, what their needs are, seems to me to be supreme for the utopian project. So there has to be a kind of intellectual decentralization, which I think is very, very important.
I think that is true. Although if it were up to me to sort of design our utopia, I would attach a kind of a rider to that, or an asterisk, in the sense that I think limited centralization is almost certainly going to be a feature of any real utopia that we bring about. And I mean, in a quite limited way, but that it seems to me it's very likely that a central authority regulating resource use, for example, is likely to be, and perhaps prescribing a certain minimum, I mean, obviously a minimum of rights to be observed by any local utopia. It seems to me that that there's a way in which our rightful admiration of kind of local experiments in utopia is excessively consistent with a globalizing world extremely centralized in a few features, a few minimal features of its own having to do with the laws of global trade. And it seems to me that we want to replace a kind of capitalist centralism with a kind of minimal, I would call it perhaps eco-socialist centralism, that leaves to various localities nearly everything of consequence, but not everything of consequence, because of the interconnectedness of these localities, especially on an ecological basis with all other ones. And so that, one essentially says, regardless of the, resource endowments of your locality with its tar sands or whatever, or with its lack of water or, fossil fuels, or in fact, adequate, acreage for wind farms. Nevertheless, we need some sort of centralized coordination, de minimis, probably to do with, a certain amount of, a certain minimum of sustainability and democracy. And after that, let, 1,000 flowers bloom. But, and indeed, probably the things I'm saying sound too compatible with, democratic centralism,
yeah.
I do think we could make, go, oh, sorry.
Oh,
well,
sorry.
look, I'll just say that I think sometimes we make a fetish of the local, and that it's going to be the real trick to coordinate the kind of global and the local, rather than to say, let us oppose to the global, the local.
No, I thoroughly agree with you. It's just that we know from historical experience that we need small units to have a kind of truly functioning democratic control. So basically, to break down the concentration of power and might, we have to start from the local. But I agree with you. Just one last thought, because I've been writing a utopian novel now for a few years. It's actually a really, really interesting thing, because exactly what you mentioned now, resources, is something that you have to then think through when you're writing a novel. It's been a really interesting experience. When you're writing a philosophical or political book, you can leave it, you can be happy with a vague terminology, kind of a semi-centralized system of networks will look after the resources. And then people might nod, or they might say nonsense. But if you're writing a novel, as you know, you actually have to imagine, okay, coffee does not grow in Germany. Coffee grows in Ghana, and coffee grows, let's say, in Kenya, where I grew up. So how is the coffee going to get in our eco-socialist society to Bulgaria? Mm-hmm. And that actually is really, really helpful. And this is maybe something that also could be a way of reacting utopian thinking, because I was in Austria in a beautiful state called Vorarlberg recently. They have days of utopia. And what they do is they bring in people who talk about utopia. They bring them together with companies. And I spoke of this, and then we had a very, very interesting afternoon discussion because apparently they have a few companies that are world leaders in certain kind of high-tech gadgets, whatever, in terms of alternative energy and stuff like that. And they said that actually it would be a very helpful instrument to them to sit down and imagine not how do we solve an existing problem, but to start off from the utopian angle and say, would we have this problem if we had a completely different organizational form? And then through that kind of external reimagining to come up with a solution for the existing. And that was actually really, really inspiring for both sides, because it was a very practical usage of utopian thinking in terms of applied to kind of the mathematical solutions of today.
Yeah.
But I think the hour is nearly over, so it might be time to wind down.
Well, I wanted to jump in with two questions we got from the audience. And one of them is a perfect segue from what we were just talking about, which is from Walter Bilderbach. He asks, are either of you familiar with Malka Older's Infomocracy trilogy. I'm not familiar with it, but it presents a future world similar to what Benjamin Kunkel discussed as a utopian danger. In Older's future, the world is divided into micro-democracies of 10,000 population, each of which is either autonomous or part of a larger federation, which range from socialist anarcho-syndicalists to Chinese federation to corporate federations. So if you are familiar with this book, it might be interesting to hear your thoughts on that and what we were talking about this kind of micro local level scaling up.
Catherine, would you remind me of the title and the author? I'm not familiar with it, but
it's called Infomocracy. If I'm saying it right. And then the author is Malka Older, Malkolder.
Ilija, would you like to field that one?
I would love to, but I've never heard of the author. I've never heard of the book, so I will look it up. I can see here, it was a finalist for the Hugo Award. Just maybe one general thought. What I noticed with science fiction books is that there's very often a preoccupation with technical solutions. And I'm not sure whether this is what we need nowadays. I don't really think it's part of our utopian challenge to come up with solutions of what technology will be capable of doing in 30, 40, 50 years from now, because we know we're old enough to know that most of the things we use today were unimaginable 30 years ago. So I think that part of what is happening in science fiction writing is, for my taste, too close to the blueprint idea. So this seems to be a kind of clever way out by saying that different regions have different forms of utopia. So I'll have to read it, but no, unfortunately, I don't know it.
Well, I'm very interested to check out this book because it sounds from the question that this may be presented as this sort of utopia of utopias, as Nozick would put it, may be presented as a kind of a problem, right? That these are a bunch of localities looking after their own interests in diverse ways, and damaging the greater good. In any case, something to check out, I guess. But just to address something you just said, Ilija, I think we see in the IPCC reports a kind of bad utopianism, thinking of a kind of technological kind, in that these reports have said, well, don't worry, there will be large-scale carbon capture and storage, an unproven technology that is yet to be, achieved at scale. And of course, it's quite irresponsible just to say, well, there'll be some kind of technical fix. And in fact, this is the basis of our policy. So I think we, not only in sort of, sci-fi, but in the world as it is right before our eyes, we see the danger of kind of assuming technical fixes that, that don't exist so far.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting thought, because I've noticed with technocrats that they are willing to jump into the unknown in technological terms, but not in social political terms. So while they would say that whatever I'm or you or someone else might be suggesting in terms of radical change, that is too dangerous, they have absolutely no qualms in suggesting the most ridiculous geoengineering, which might destroy the whole planet. So this is a very interesting thing. They're very radical in their belief in technological possibility, and they're completely reactionary in their trust in political radicalism.
Yes, yeah.
I'll ask the other question, which it's one that invites speculation, which is kind of nice. So Johannes Eveline asks, does utopia as a transformational energy need awareness of crisis to fuel it, or is it truly inevitable whether or not people are aware?
Awareness of, sorry, I didn't catch.
Awareness of crisis.
Oh, okay.
So like knowing, for example, that the world is heating up and we have to change things, or it'll happen whether or not people are super aware of it.
What do you want to go ahead, Ben?
Whether the it there, you know, what might happen, whether or not people are thinking about it, is that utopian thinking?
No, whether there's a necessity to be aware of the, I would say, the scope of the crisis.
I see. Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure. I think it's the type of awareness probably that determines whether it's useful, because I think we all these days experience on probably almost a daily basis the way in which our awareness, imperfect as it is, but also very pressing as it is, of this kind of you know, crisis on the level of our civilization and the level of the ecosphere, at times pushes us towards utopianism and at other times towards despair. So it's the very same awareness, at least in my own experience, is on a kind of knife edge between hope and despair. So at times I think, well, you know, actually the civilizational crisis we're experiencing right now will be a forcing agent for a better world. And other times I think, you know, increasingly people are just throwing up their hands, and which population I belong to, or the utopians or the people throwing up their hands, tends to change on a daily basis. So I think, you know, awareness of crisis is important, but that awareness is double-edged.
Well, my answer would be that if you need to be made aware of a crisis, you're leading a very privileged life. While the vast majority of humanity has actually a very kind of sensitive interaction to every crisis there is. I noticed that very, very clearly in the 5.5 years that I spent in Mumbai, where I was living next to a slum, and I had to read in the newspaper what was happening. People in the slum were aware of every crisis, whether there was water shortage, whether there was a communal unrest, whether there was violence by the police, whether there was flooding, anything bad that happened in Bombay. They had a kind of, they had their ears to the ground, and they knew and they experienced every crisis. So it is partly, I think, our problem that we, in the privileged kind of centers of the Western world, we are kind of, until recently, capable of living a life that kind of was blind to these dramatic forms of crisis. My guess is that is changing. I think the pandemic was just the beginning. We had in Germany, of course, absolutely terrible flooding. We are going to live through all forms of disastrous consequences of the way we grow food within the next 5 to 10 years. So the whole kind of industrial agricultural complex will become, I think, a truly suffocating and I think for nearly everybody. So I completely agree with you with what you said in the beginning. We're now entering a phase of probably non-stop, ongoing, exasperating kind of crescendos of crisis. And then no one will actually ask the question. The question will be very much what you just said. Are we going to come together to find solutions that lead to a good life for everyone? Or are we going to try and have some kind of new feudal exclusive communities that kind of, with the weapons of destruction and extermination, that isolate us from all these places that are going down? I think basically that's going to be the fight.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's even already begun. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Any other questions?
Nothing that came through. Do either of you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
I guess I have a question that I'd like to ask Ilija before we wrap things up. I'm curious about how your disposition towards utopia, your utopian thinking has changed, if at all, over the course of your own biological life. I find in my own case, the reason I ask this is because I find in my own case that once upon a time my interest in utopia was probably a bit different than it is today, because I was young enough to hope that if utopia came about soon enough, it could mold me as a person. Whereas I feel that now I will remain forever a personality of the old world that is passing away, which doesn't mean that I'm not very interested and desirous of the type of utopian solutions we've been talking about. But I found that my own investment in them has changed somewhat, and in the sense that I realize that now I'm sort of doomed, even if utopia comes about, to have a sort of pre-utopian personality.
That's a brilliant thought. I have a very good friend who's a great Bosnian novelist, Djevat Karahasan, and he always says, in my time, and then you realize that he's talking about the 4th century BC in Athens. He was a professor of kind of classics or something. So you would walk with him through Sarajevo and he would say, oh, in my time there was, and then it's like 1327. and it occurred to me one day that I could never say that, because whenever I feel really, really comfortable in a certain historical framework, it's always been in something that it's imagined. So in my time, if I had to use that expression, I would say in my time in the 23rd century. So my sense is that I was unfortunately born too early, and that for some bizarre reason, I couldn't tell you why, I'm incredibly optimistic. And I think that the human race has such an incredible potential to be at peace with itself and with nature and with the planet. And we've just scratched the surface. And it's a bit like, Einstein pointed out that, people asked him, how can you keep all these things in your head? And he said, well, you should know we only use about 2 to 3% of our brain. And I think it's the same with humanity. We've only used 2 to 3% of our potential. It's actually quite ridiculous. I mean, most of history is just this ongoing narrative of violence and exploitation. It's way below what we could be. That I always thought to myself, no, our time will come. I mean, there's no way it could be. This can't be the end of the story. I mean, it would be such a badly written novel if this was the end. After messing up and fucking up for a few thousand years, we then destroyed the planet and that was it. I mean, no way. There has to be a better ending to the story. So in my time in the 23rd century, we will fondly remember you.
Well, I appreciate it.
Well, on that note, as we've been cycling through hope and despair over the course of an hour, I'm going to end the event on that note of radical hope for us really pulling through and having another 2 millennia left in us, or 2 centuries left in us. So thank you so much to both Ben and Ilija for this really engaging and illuminating conversation. I feel rejuvenated for the rest of my day. So that is such a treat to have this happen in the middle of the day here. Thank you both for your participation. Thank you everyone who joined us for watching. We're happy to have you, and we hope to see you at future events. The next event in this series is in person in New York On November 1st, Doris Knalein, Frederica Meyer, and Mariana Mogilovic from the Architecture League are going to be talking about the city after Corona, hopefully another conversation about hopeful futures and not bad ones. But yeah, thank you all so much, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you, Ilija.
Thank you.
Take care.